In 1991, 6-year-old Ethan Ward disappeared while playing a game of tag with his cousins during a family camping trip in Pine Creek National Forest, nestled in the heart of Montana. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of him was ever found. It wasn't until 29 years later that a seemingly unrelated discovery across the country would finally bring new leads in the cold case, unearthing a terrifying truth. The crackle of dry leaves and the soft murmur of voices filled the campsite as the early evening sun filtered through the towering pines. The smell of damp earth and burning logs mixed with the faint scent of marshmallows roasting over the fire. James Ward, Ethan's father, sat in a folding chair near the fire pit, absently stirring a cup of lukewarm coffee as he watched his children dash between the tents. Ethan, small and quick, zipped through the trees with his red and white shirt flapping behind him, cheeks rosy from running. His older brother, Alex, 11 years old, led the group, while their cousins, Luke and Jody, followed in close pursuit. They'd been playing all day, the game of tag expanding further each time, crossing the boundaries of what James called within sight. "All right, let's switch," Alex called, his voice echoing through the trees. "You guys hide, and I'll count." Ethan's eyes gleamed with excitement as he darted away before the counting even began. James barely had time to lift his head before the children disappeared into the woods. He called after them, but it was only a faint murmur, swallowed by the rustling of the leaves. "Stay close," he said half-heartedly, watching as the blur of movement dissolved into the distance. He turned back to the fire where his wife, Laura, was preparing dinner. She glanced over at him, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "They'll tire themselves out eventually." James didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the fading blur of his children, vanishing behind the thick trunks of trees. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, sharp shadows across the forest floor. Ethan's chosen hiding spot was near the forest's edge, just before the ridge that dropped sharply into a deep ravine. The area was densely packed with trees, their thick roots weaving in and out of the soft soil. A large, decaying log lay across the ground, offering a perfect hiding place for a child as small as Ethan. He crouched behind it, heart pounding. Not out of fear, but out of the thrill of knowing he'd hidden so well no one would find him for ages. For a while, he stayed perfectly still, the faint rustling of leaves around him and the distant sound of laughter barely reaching his ears. Time passed, but Ethan didn't move. His legs began to ache from the awkward crouch, and as the light around him dimmed, he shifted slightly to get more comfortable. That's when he heard it, a faint rustling sound behind him, far too deliberate to be the wind. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head, half expecting to see one of his cousins sneaking up to tag him. But there was no one there. The rustling grew louder, closer, more insistent. The air had cooled noticeably, and the woods had fallen eerily silent. Back at the campsite, the other children had returned, laughing and out of breath, covered in dirt from the day's games. James glanced up, counting heads. "Where's Ethan?" he asked, his voice rising as he stood. Alex shrugged. "He was running off to hide by the ridge. I thought he'd be here." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't he with you?" "I haven't seen him for a while," Luke piped up. "He was hiding near the ridge, though." James's stomach tightened. "He wouldn't have gone far," he muttered, walking towards the trees, his voice now tinged with concern. He called Ethan's name, but it came back to him in echoes, unanswered. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he combed the trails, his calls growing louder, more frantic. Laura joined him, the children trailing behind, but there was still no sign of Ethan. When they reached the ridge, the last light of day was slipping away behind the trees. James stopped short. "He wouldn't have gone down there," he said, his voice thick with disbelief, though the tightening in his chest told him otherwise. The search continued until nightfall. Flashlights scoured the underbrush, cutting through the dark, but the forest held its secrets. The rain began falling at 10 p.m., light at first, but then heavier, turning the forest floor into a muddy mess. By morning, the rain had washed away any trace of Ethan, leaving the searchers with nothing but cold, empty woods. The days following Ethan's disappearance blurred together. The authorities arrived, bringing in search dogs, helicopters, and volunteers. But by the end of the week, the forest remained silent. James and Laura stood at the ranger station, answering the same questions over and over. "He was wearing a red and white shirt," James repeated. "Jeans and sneakers. His rain jacket was back at the tent. He doesn't wander off." But the woods offered no answers. They searched for days, for weeks. Theories began to emerge. Some suggested Ethan had fallen into the ravine. Others whispered about wild animals in the area. But nothing added up. As weeks passed, James refused to leave the forest. Every morning, he returned to the ridge, staring out into the trees as if Ethan might simply walk back into view. As time went on, the case grew colder, the trail growing colder with every year. Ethan's disappearance remained unsolved, and the family's pain festered. The forest, once a place of family fun, became a silent monument to their loss. The gravel crunched under James Ward's boots as he stepped out of his truck, the cool Montana air biting at his skin. Above him, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The trees that once seemed to embrace him now stood taller, their trunks thicker and their branches dense with foliage. The campsite, a place where memories of Ethan's laughter had once echoed, was now overtaken by wild shrubs and creeping vines. Time had stolen the place that had once felt like home. James moved slowly towards the clearing where the tents had once stood. There was nothing left to mark the spot officially. No signs, no plaques, just nature reclaiming what it could. The fire pit, now nothing but a shallow depression filled with moss, barely resembled the place where he'd sat countless times with his family. It was just a clearing in the woods, a forgotten place swallowed by years of silence. He crouched beside the old cedar tree, his knees creaking as he lowered himself. His fingers brushed away a layer of decaying leaves, revealing the familiar shape of the spot where Ethan had hidden all those years ago. The ground here was soft, the scent of pine still lingering in the air. The same patch of earth where his son had crouched, eager to win the game of tag. Ethan had known every inch of this place, instinctively memorizing the shape of the ridge, the texture of the soil, and the way the trees bent around the clearing. He had spent hours here as a child, playing in the same spot over and over, creating a mental map of the forest, just like every child does with their favorite place. James sat there for a long time, staring at the ground, his thoughts drifting through the years. The theories, the rumors, and the never-ending questions about what had happened to his son. Some people had believed Ethan had wandered off and gotten lost. Others whispered about wild animals, maybe even a cougar lurking in the trees. There were also those who claimed to have seen a man in the area, someone who didn't look like he belonged. Perhaps an abduction, maybe even a kidnapping. But James knew better. He didn't believe any of those theories. Ethan wouldn't have run off. He wouldn't have just disappeared without a trace. Something else had happened that day. Something he had never been able to prove. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants, and looked around the campsite one last time. He knew he would never return here, not like this. The silence, the unanswered questions had to be enough. He had to leave this place behind. Back in Seattle, Detective Sarah Lynch sat at her desk, flipping through a stack of case files. The cold case of Ethan Ward had haunted her ever since the strange discovery made months ago. A child's shoe, worn and muddy, had been found in a storage unit near Tacoma, Washington, and the name Ethan written inside the tongue of the shoe had sparked a renewed investigation into a series of disappearances that spanned decades. The shoe was the link she'd been searching for, but it raised even more questions than answers. The shoe itself was unsettling, old, worn, with frayed Velcro and traces of mud on the soles that matched the soil from Pine Creek National Forest. The handwriting inside was distinct, almost too careful, as though written by someone who had been helping a young child learn how to write their name. Lynch had her team run tests, but everything came back as expected. The shoe dated back to the early 1990s, possibly even 1991, the year Ethan went missing. Her investigation had led her to re-examine other cases from that same period, as well as more recent ones, and it quickly became clear that there was a pattern. A series of abductions, all involving children between the ages of 5 and 12, disappearing from campsites or remote hiking areas. Lynch's instincts told her that the cases weren't unrelated. They were tied to one person, someone who had been operating for years under the radar, moving from state to state, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The shoe had led her to one name, Martin Greaves. Martin Greaves was a man who had always managed to remain just below the radar. His history was a patchwork of aliases, fake IDs, and a trail of jobs that didn't add up. The more Lynch looked into him, the more elusive he became. He had no official address, no records of family or friends. He had worked odd jobs in national parks and campgrounds across the West Coast, but never stayed in one place for long. What Lynch found most disturbing were the files that didn't fit into the timeline. Cases where children had vanished, but no one had connected the dots. The disappearances spanned over 2 decades, most of them occurring in national parks or isolated camping areas. But no one had ever seen a pattern, and no one had ever linked the name Martin Greaves to any of them. That is, until now. One of the victims had been found alive, Paige Winslow, who had been abducted just a year ago. She had been missing for 2 weeks before being discovered, traumatized but alive, in a remote cabin deep in the Oregon woods. Paige had been drugged, her memory of the events blurry and fragmented. But there was one detail she had never forgotten. The man who had kept her, the one she had called the caretaker, had often spoken of the others, the children who came before her. Max Ward had spent years running from the past. He had become a photographer, always traveling, always away from home. The pain of losing his little brother, Ethan, had never left him. The memory of that day, the way Ethan had disappeared so suddenly without a trace, was something Max had carried with him. It was a wound that never healed. Now, decades later, Max found himself receiving a call from Detective Lynch. "Max Ward?" her voice asked, calm but serious. "Yeah, this is Max," he replied, unsure of what was happening. "We've recovered something we believe might be linked to your brother's case," she said carefully. "We need you to come in and see it in person. Are you able to come to Seattle?" Max's heart sank, but something in her tone made him listen more closely. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight. "A shoe. A child's shoe. The name Ethan was written inside. It's connected to a string of disappearances, and we think we might have found a lead." Max didn't speak for a long time. His thoughts raced. The past he had tried to bury was surfacing again. Finally, he responded, "I'll be there." He didn't know it then, but that phone call would lead him into the heart of the investigation, into a web of lies, and into a confrontation with the man who had stolen his brother all those years ago. Max arrived in Seattle with a sense of dread hanging over him. He hadn't thought about Ethan in years, not in any real, tangible way. But the phone call from Detective Lynch had opened a door he had tried to keep closed for so long. His brother's face had faded from his mind, replaced by a dozen faces of strangers he met on his travels. But now, as he stepped into the cold, sterile office of the Seattle Police Department, the weight of his family's tragedy felt heavy on his shoulders once again. Detective Sarah Lynch greeted him with a nod, leading him to a small, sterile room in the back. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The case was clearly not her first priority. She had a calm, measured demeanor, but her eyes betrayed the urgency of the situation. She placed a manila folder on the table and slid it over to him. Max didn't move at first. He stared at the folder, not sure if he wanted to open it or not. He had spent so many years trying to forget about that day. But now it was impossible. Finally, with a slow, deliberate motion, he opened it. Inside, there was a single photograph of a muddy, worn sneaker, the same one that had been shown in the news report. The words Ethan were barely visible on the inside, written in a child's hand. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at it, the recognition hitting him like a freight train. "It was found in a storage unit near Tacoma," Lynch said, her voice cutting through the silence. "We ran it through every database we had. There were no matches for a missing child at the time. But the handwriting inside the shoe, It matched a child's handwriting from a case we've been following. Max's heart pounded in his chest. What case? The disappearance of Ethan Ward. The shoe, along with several other pieces of evidence, were found in a storage unit that had been rented under a false name. We've linked it to someone named Martin Greaves. We believe he's been involved in a series of abductions stretching back years. Max looked up at her, his mind reeling. Greaves? That name. It's a common alias, Lynch interrupted, sensing his confusion. There are no records of him under that name, but he's been connected to multiple disappearances. All children who vanished from remote locations, mostly national parks or campsites. Max felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they felt like pieces from someone else's nightmare. Lynch continued. This is part of a much larger pattern we've been investigating. We found out that Greaves doesn't just abduct children. He keeps them. He's been doing it for decades. Max's mind flashed back to his childhood, to the woods around Pine Creek National Forest, to the very place where Ethan had vanished. Had he been taken? Had Greaves been there that day, waiting, watching? Why now? Max asked quietly, staring at the shoe. Why after all these years? That's what we're trying to figure out, Lynch replied. But the shoe, the evidence, it's undeniable. It's tied to your brother, Max. Max closed his eyes, the familiar ache of loss threatening to overwhelm him. He had always wondered what had happened to Ethan, what had become of him in the years after he vanished from the woods. But the truth was something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Lynch shifted, pulling out another file. This one was thicker, containing maps and photographs. These are the records we've uncovered so far, she said. We've traced Greaves' movements. He's been active in national parks across the country, always in remote, hard-to-reach locations. Each time a child goes missing, he moves on to a different area. He's methodical, and he's very good at covering his tracks. Max flipped through the papers, his eyes skimming over the maps and photos. The locations seemed random at first glance, but there was a pattern. Each site was within an hour's reach of major highways, easy to access but difficult to investigate. And in every case, a child had gone missing from a popular camping spot or trail. One photograph caught his attention. It was a grainy, black and white image of a small, cramped room, lit only by a weak bulb overhead. In the corner of the frame, a figure lay on a cot, his eyes closed, his face obscured by shadows. Max's pulse quickened as he stared at the image. The child's shape, the posture. It looked familiar, too familiar. Who is that? He asked, his voice tight. We don't know yet, Lynch replied, her tone solemn. But the resemblance is striking. We believe it might be your brother, Max. Max swallowed hard, his throat dry. Ethan? Lynch nodded. We think he was kept by Greaves. For years, maybe. That room. It could be where he was held. Max felt his world tilt. The photo, the name. Everything was pulling him deeper into a nightmare he wasn't sure he could wake up from. The next morning, after a restless night filled with memories and unanswered questions, Max received another call from Detective Lynch. We need you to come to the evidence room, she said. We've found something else. Max's stomach turned as he hung up the phone. He had no idea what else they had uncovered, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure how much more he could take. He drove to the police station, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind consumed with thoughts of Ethan, of the child in the photo, of the life his brother might have lived in the shadows for all these years. When he arrived, Lynch was waiting for him at the door of the evidence room. She handed him a folder, her expression unreadable. Max opened it. Inside, there were more photos, Polaroids of children, their faces pale and empty, staring blankly at the camera. Some were sleeping, some sitting upright, others curled up in what appeared to be a makeshift bed. But what stood out were the details in the background. A wooden shelf, a faded map on the wall, and a faint but unmistakable logo on a small poster. Max's breath caught. The logo was from West Grove Campgrounds, a place he and his family had visited once when he was a child. It was closed down years ago, but the memory of that place was still sharp in his mind. "Do you recognize it?" Lynch asked, her voice steady but tense. Max nodded slowly. "I've been there. A long time ago." Lynch didn't wait for him to finish processing. She slid another photograph across the table. This one was different. It showed a man, his face obscured, but his posture unmistakable. It was the same figure from the grainy photo of the child on the cot. The man was standing in the background, a gloved hand just barely visible, reaching into the shot. Max's hands shook as he reached for the photo. He didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear. The connection was too strong to ignore. "That's him," Max whispered, almost to himself. Max stared at the photo, his fingers trembling as he held it. The man in the background, just a blurred silhouette in the grainy photo, was the same man who had been haunting his mind for days. The connection was undeniable. That hand, that posture, it wasn't a coincidence. It was the same figure he had seen before, in the other photographs, in the faint memory of something lurking at the edges of his past. "That's him, isn't it?" Lynch's voice broke through his thoughts. Max nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling on him like a heavy cloak. "It has to be. I've seen him before, or someone like him, when I was younger. It's like he's been following us. Following Ethan." Lynch was silent for a moment, taking in his words. She knew what this meant. It was a connection, a thread in a complex web that had been unraveling for months. But they still didn't know enough. There was too much that didn't add up, too many pieces missing. "We need to dig deeper," Lynch said quietly. "We've found other photos, other cases tied to this man. His name is still a mystery, but we know he's been operating in the same pattern for years. A few weeks ago, we got a tip about a man matching his description near a campground in Oregon. But by the time we arrived, he was gone." Max clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up. He couldn't just sit back and wait. This was about Ethan, his brother, who had been lost to him for so long. He couldn't allow the man who had taken him to slip away again. "I need to see him," Max said, his voice low but determined. "The man in the photos. I need to know who he is. If it's the same person, if it's connected to Ethan, I have to see it through." Lynch looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words. She knew how much this case had already taken from him, how much of his life had been spent chasing ghosts from the past. But there was something in Max's eyes, something resolute, that told her this wasn't just another part of the investigation. This was personal. "All right," she said, "we'll get you into the field. But I need you to promise me you'll stay safe. We don't know who we're dealing with yet, and we can't take any chances." Max nodded without hesitation. "I'm not backing down. Not this time." It wasn't long before Max and Lynch were back in the field, traveling toward the remote campgrounds in Oregon where they believed the man, Martin Greaves or whatever name he was using, might be hiding. The drive felt long and endless, the heavy fog rolling in off the coastline, swallowing the road in a haze of white. Max couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, the shoe, the photos, and now this man, who had been in the background of so many unsettling moments, who had quietly shaped the course of his life without him even knowing. How had this man come to know his family? Had he been watching them all along? The forest around them seemed to close in, dark and foreboding. The towering trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The deeper they went into the wilderness, the more isolated everything felt. It was as if they were slipping back into a time when Ethan was just a child, running through the trees, laughing, playing tag without a care in the world. They reached the campground just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the deserted site. The cabins were old, many of them boarded up, some with their windows cracked or shattered. The area had long been abandoned, but the air still held a sense of tension, as if something or someone was hiding in the depths of the forest. Max got out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound breaking the silence. Lynch was already pulling out the map, scanning it for any signs of recent activity. "We've got a team waiting nearby," Lynch said, her voice steady but strained. "If we find anything, we'll move quickly. But keep your eyes open. This place is a ghost town, and there's no telling what we'll find. Max nodded, his pulse quickening. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. He felt a chill run down his spine. They weren't alone here. He could feel it. There was something in the shadows, something watching them. The search began quietly, methodically. They checked the cabins first, the ones that were still standing. Most were empty, abandoned years ago, their interiors covered in dust and cobwebs. But in the back of one cabin, they found something that made Max's stomach churn. A small wooden chest. It was old, battered, but it was still intact. Lynch pulled it out from beneath a pile of debris, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the rusty latch. Inside, there were papers, old documents, maps, and a stack of photographs. But it wasn't the photos that made Max's heart stop. It was the name, written in faded ink on a piece of paper at the top of the stack. Martin Greaves. Max's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the connection they had been searching for. The man who had taken Ethan, who had taken so many others. He scanned the papers quickly. Most were indecipherable, but the maps were chilling. Locations marked in red ink, dots spread across national parks and remote camping areas. Each one linked to a missing child. Are you seeing this? Max's voice was barely a whisper. Lynch nodded. It's him. We've got him, Max. But Max didn't feel the relief he expected. Instead, there was a deep, gnawing feeling in his gut. A sense that they were just scratching the surface. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Max couldn't shake the feeling that they had only uncovered the smallest piece of the puzzle. As he stared at the papers in the chest, the sickening realization hit him harder than before. This was bigger than just Ethan. This was an entire network of abductions, spanning decades, meticulously planned by a man who had learned how to stay hidden in plain sight. Martin Greaves wasn't just a single predator. He was a shadow in the woods, a ghost that had been slipping through the cracks of the system for years. This is it, Lynch said, her voice tight with disbelief. She was holding up one of the maps, her finger tracing the dots. These locations, they match up with missing child reports across the country. We're not dealing with a single case. This is something much more organized. Max nodded, his mind racing. He thought of Ethan, of all the other children who had vanished without a trace. Each dot on the map represented a lost life, a family torn apart by the same monster who had taken his brother. The enormity of the situation was overwhelming, but they had no time to dwell on it. The night was falling, and the urgency to find Greaves was growing with each passing hour. Max turned to Lynch, his voice low but determined. We need to find him. Now. Lynch didn't hesitate. She called in the backup team, relaying their findings over the radio. They would need to move fast. The area around them was desolate. No neighbors, no nearby towns. They were deep in the forest, far away from any help, and Greaves had a head start. But Lynch wasn't about to let him slip away again. They moved quickly, checking the rest of the cabins, searching for any signs of recent activity. It wasn't until they reached the last one that they found something significant. The door creaked as Max pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing the beam of his flashlight. The cabin was small, sparse, and smelled of stale air and damp wood. But something was off. Max's eyes scanned the room, and then he saw it. A faded poster on the wall, partially torn, with letters peeling away. It was a map of the old West Grove campgrounds, the same place from the photographs they had found in the chest. Max's pulse quickened. This was it, the connection was here, right in front of him. The poster, the maps, the signs, they were all pointing to one thing. This place had been a base of operations for Greaves. He had used it as a hideout, a place to bring his victims before moving them on to who knew where. Lynch stepped forward, her flashlight scanning the floor. Look, she said, pointing to the ground near the corner of the cabin. Max bent down and saw the faintest traces of a trail leading deeper into the woods. It was faint, barely visible, but it was enough. It was recent. Someone had walked through here, dragging something heavy behind them. Max's heart raced. They're not far, Max said, almost to himself. We're getting closer. Lynch looked at him, her face serious. We need to move. Now. They gathered their gear quickly, retracing the faint trail. The mist had begun to settle in, cloaking the woods in an eerie silence. The air was damp, the ground beneath them slick with moisture as they pushed forward, following the trail through the underbrush. Every crack of a twig underfoot felt like a threat. Every rustle in the leaves made Max's pulse spike. They moved in silence, each step carrying them deeper into the heart of the forest. Time seemed to stretch, the minutes feeling like hours as the darkness closed in around them. The trees loomed above, their branches twisting and creaking in the wind. Max's mind was racing. What was he going to find? Would he finally have answers about what happened to Ethan all those years ago? Or would he discover something even more terrifying than he could imagine? The trail led them to a clearing, and at the far side of it, they saw a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, but Max knew better than to assume anything. This was it. The place where Greaves had been hiding all these years. Lynch motioned for the team to stop. They had to be careful. The cabin was isolated, but it didn't mean Greaves was alone. There could be traps, other victims, or even more dangerous surprises waiting inside. Max felt his throat tighten. The idea of walking into that cabin, knowing what it might hold, made his skin crawl. But he had no choice. He had to go in. "Ready?" Lynch asked, her voice steady. Max nodded, but inside he was anything but ready. The weight of everything, his brother, the years of searching, the trail that had led them here, was almost too much to bear. They advanced cautiously toward the cabin, their flashlights cutting through the dark. As they neared the door, Max's heart hammered in his chest. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had just walked out or had been waiting for them to arrive. Lynch motioned for the team to hold back as she pushed the door open slowly. The creaking sound felt deafening in the silence. Inside, the cabin was dark, but the faint light of the flashlights illuminated a scene that made Max's stomach churn. There were cages, small, makeshift cages, stacked in one corner of the room. The air was thick with the smell of old, stale food and dampness. On the floor, scattered papers lay in disarray, some torn, some half-burned. There were remnants of something, a life interrupted. And then Max saw something that stopped him cold. A small piece of fabric, torn and frayed, lying on the floor. It was a child's shirt. Max's breath caught in his throat. His mind flashed back to Ethan. The shirt, the memories, and then it hit him. He wasn't alone in the cabin. Lynch moved forward cautiously, scanning the room. "Max!" Her voice was quiet but urgent. "Look!" Max turned slowly, following her gaze. There, sitting in the shadows, huddled on the floor, was a figure. A child. It was too dark to see clearly, but the shape, small, fragile, and curled into itself, was unmistakable. Max's heart lurched. "Ethan?" he whispered, his voice cracking, but there was no response. Just the figure in the shadows, staring blankly at the ground. Max's heart raced in his chest as he stepped forward, his breath shallow. "Ethan?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. He couldn't take his eyes off the small, hunched figure, barely distinguishable in the darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to rush forward, but he held back. This was no longer just a simple search. Whatever he was about to find, it was going to change everything. Lynch moved closer, her voice calm but firm. "We need to approach slowly. We don't know what state they're in." Max nodded, his hands trembling. His mind was racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. The figure, small, slumped, almost childlike, was all too familiar. The tattered shirt, the thin limbs. Couldn't be anyone else but Ethan. "Ethan?" Max said again, taking another step forward, his voice trembling this time. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, motionless, as if waiting for something. Anything. Max's heart ached with a raw intensity he hadn't felt in years. He knew in his gut that this was his brother. But the boy he was looking at didn't seem real. Ethan's face, if it could be seen, was obscured by a thick curtain of tangled hair. Lynch, sensing his need to reach out, stayed behind. "Max," she said, her voice low and steady. "Don't rush it. If it is Ethan, he may be in shock. We need to be careful. Max didn't hear her. All that mattered now was the small figure, the boy who had once been his brother, and the possibility that Ethan had been here all along. Trapped, hidden, living in the shadows. The years of uncertainty, of unanswered questions, were surging back, stronger than ever. Max crouched down in front of the figure, his voice trembling as he finally spoke the words that had been buried deep inside him for years. "Ethan, it's me. Max, do you remember me?" The boy's head twitched slightly, but still there was no response. Max's heart sank. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering just above the boy's shoulder. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment. He had expected joy, relief, perhaps even anger. But this was nothing like he had thought. This was something else. Max's hand gently touched the boy's shoulder, and the reaction was immediate. The figure flinched, a sharp intake of breath, before slowly, cautiously, the boy's head lifted. Max's breath caught in his throat. He saw it then. The face, the eyes that had once been so full of life, now vacant and hollow. The skin was pale, the eyes sunken, the expression blank. But it was Ethan, or what was left of him. The sharp jawline, the familiar nose, the faint scar near his eyebrow. It was all there. But the eyes, they were empty. As if the boy sitting in front of him wasn't the same person he once knew. As if the years of captivity, the torment, the isolation, had erased everything Max had remembered about his younger brother. Ethan blinked slowly, as if trying to focus, as if his mind was struggling to catch up with the reality of the moment. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he spoke, the words jagged, disjointed. "Max!" Max's breath hitched. He didn't know what to say. The child he had been searching for, the child who had vanished without a trace all those years ago, was sitting right in front of him, but he was no longer the same. The man Greaves had taken him, and now what was left of him? Ethan's gaze flickered, focusing briefly on Max before darting to the side, as if something unseen was lurking in the shadows of the cabin. "Where am I?" Ethan asked, his voice distant, confused. Max's heart clenched. "You're safe now. You're with me. You're not alone anymore." Ethan didn't respond. His eyes shifted again, restless, his body trembling. He seemed like he was trapped in a world of his own, unable or unwilling to return to the reality Max was trying to pull him into. This was no longer the same child Max had known. Lynch stepped forward cautiously, her voice calm. "Ethan, can you understand us? Can you tell us what happened?" But Ethan's eyes glazed over, and with one sharp motion, he turned away from both of them. His body shuddered as he curled into himself, trying to make himself smaller, to retreat further into the shadows. Max's chest tightened. The boy before him, the brother he had spent years mourning, wasn't the same person anymore. Whatever Greaves had done to him, however long he had kept him locked away, had taken more than just Ethan's childhood. It had taken his spirit. "We need to get him out of here," Lynch said softly, her tone breaking the silence. "He's not in a good state. We need medical attention, a psychologist, someone who can help him process this." Max nodded, his throat tight with unshed tears. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined. But there was no time to dwell on that. They had to get Ethan out of here, away from this cabin, away from whatever had happened to him in this place. It was only then that Max realized how much he had hoped for the person he once knew, the brother who would run to him with a smile and a hug. But now, the only thing that mattered was getting Ethan back, getting him out of the nightmare he had been trapped in for so long. They moved quickly, Lynch giving instructions to the team outside to secure the cabin and prepare for immediate extraction. As Max crouched beside Ethan, his hand still resting on his brother's arm, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. The years lost, the lives broken, the truth that had been hidden for far too long. "We'll get you out of here," Max whispered again, more to himself than to Ethan. "I promise." As they left the cabin behind, Max's mind raced. He didn't know what the future held for Ethan or what recovery would look like. All he knew was that the boy he had lost so long ago had finally been found, broken, but alive. And that, at least, was a start. The air outside felt colder as Max and Lynch made their way back toward the extraction point. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the towering trees blocking out what little light remained. Max could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, his legs aching, his mind clouded by everything he had just witnessed. Ethan was with them, but the boy in front of him wasn't the brother he had known. The reality of what had happened to Ethan over the past decades settled in, and Max knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They reached the waiting vehicles, where the medical team and a few law enforcement officers were already preparing for their departure. Ethan had been placed in a seat, though he sat with his body hunched, his eyes unfocused. He hadn't spoken much since the initial shock of seeing Max. He wasn't the same boy who had once laughed and played. He was broken, a shell of the child he had been. Max took a seat beside him, not sure what to say or how to comfort him. The boy's body trembled, and he kept his gaze fixed on the window, staring out into the darkness of the woods. Every few minutes, he would blink as if waking from a dream, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no connection to the world outside. Lynch sat down across from them, her face a mixture of sympathy and determination. "We need to get him somewhere safe," she said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "He's in shock. We'll have doctors examine him as soon as we get to the facility. We need to make sure he's physically okay before we move forward with anything else." Max nodded absently. His mind was still reeling from everything he had just learned. From the evidence in the cabin, the maps, the photographs, the terrifying realization that Martin Greaves had been involved in so many disappearances. And now Ethan, his brother, was part of that horrific puzzle. As the vehicle began to move, Max glanced over at Ethan, trying to find some sign of the boy he had once known. But there was nothing, no spark, no joy, no recognition. Ethan's face remained blank, his body still, as if the life had been drained from him. Max reached over, his hand brushing against Ethan's. The boy didn't react, but Max kept his hand there, needing to make some kind of connection, even if it was just the slightest touch. The road ahead was unclear. They were heading to a facility where Ethan would receive the care he desperately needed, but Max knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Healing, if it even happened, would take years. The trauma Ethan had suffered was deep, far deeper than Max had ever imagined. The boy in front of him was a stranger, someone lost to time and torment, and it pained Max to think of the boy who had been his brother, his cheerful, energetic little brother, now lost to the darkness. The hours passed in silence as they made their way toward the medical facility. Max sat next to Ethan, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to ask. What had happened to him all these years? How had he survived? What kind of man had Martin Greaves become? And what had he done to Ethan? But it was clear that, for now, the answers wouldn't come. Not from Ethan. Not from anyone. The silence between them was deafening. By the time they arrived at the facility, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. Max was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was no time to rest. They had arrived at the facility, and Ethan needed immediate medical attention. As the vehicle came to a stop, medical staff rushed forward, ready to take Ethan inside. Max stood up, hesitant. "Can I go with him?" he asked, his voice quiet. The nurse who met them nodded, understanding the need for reassurance. "Of course, we'll take good care of him, but right now he needs to be examined. You can stay with him for as long as he's able." Max nodded, though he wasn't sure what kind of comfort he could offer his brother. Ethan had been lost for so long. So much had happened to him in the years since his disappearance. Max's heart ached for him, but he knew there was no easy solution. There was no magic word, no simple gesture that would make everything okay. Ethan had to find his own way through the darkness. Inside, the sterile, quiet hallways felt miles away from the wilderness they had just left behind. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a pale glow on the walls. Max followed as the medical staff guided Ethan into a room, where they began their initial assessments. Max stood by the door, watching quietly as the doctors worked. They spoke in low voices, their words clinical. But Max couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this place. The man who had been his brother, the boy he had loved, was now a broken piece of the past, caught in a world he couldn't understand. Hours passed as the doctors ran tests and evaluated Ethan's condition. The trauma was apparent in his frailty, his unwillingness to speak, the distance in his eyes. They gave him sedatives to calm him, and Max watched helplessly, unsure of what he could do to help. Later that evening, after the tests were done, Max was allowed to sit with Ethan in a quiet room. The boy was lying in a bed, his eyes half closed, but his body still stiff with tension. Max sat by his side, his hand resting on the edge of the bed. "I'm here," Max said softly, though he wasn't sure Ethan could even hear him. "I won't leave you, I promise." The hours dragged on. The world outside continued to move, but in this small room, Max was stuck in time, clinging to the hope that, somehow, Ethan would find his way back. He didn't know how long it would take. He didn't know if the brother he had lost would ever return to him. But for the first time in years, he was sitting next to Ethan, and that, at least, was something. As Max sat there, his mind wandering through memories of the past, of the days before the disappearance, of the games they had played, the laughter they had shared, a faint sound broke through the silence. Ethan's voice. Max leaned forward, heart pounding. "Ethan?" he whispered. The boy's eyes fluttered open, though they were clouded with confusion. He looked up at Max, recognition flickering in his gaze for the briefest moment. "Max!" Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. Max felt his heart skip a beat. "I'm here. You're safe." Ethan blinked slowly, as if trying to understand. I remember you," he whispered again, his voice barely more than a breath. "I'm sorry." Max shook his head, tears threatening to spill. "You don't have to be sorry. You didn't do anything wrong. You're safe now." For the first time since he'd found Ethan, Max allowed himself a moment of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the days passed, Max remained by Ethan's side. The hospital room had become their world. Despite the steady progress in Ethan's physical recovery, it was clear that the boy who had disappeared all those years ago was still a stranger in many ways. His mind was slow to catch up with the present, constantly drifting between fragments of memory and the fog of trauma that had built up over the years. Max had been told it would take time, and that healing, especially the kind Ethan needed, couldn't be rushed. There were days when Ethan would speak, small, broken words, his voice hoarse and weak. Other days, he would retreat into silence again, staring out the window at the world that had moved on without him. Max watched it all with a sense of helplessness. He couldn't force his brother to return to the person he once was. All he could do was be there, hold his hand when Ethan needed it, speak softly when the silence became too heavy, and give him the space he needed to process the years lost to darkness. Lynch had kept her distance, respecting Max's space, but she continued to check in with him. She had also been working tirelessly behind the scenes, tracking down leads, digging deeper into Greaves' past, trying to uncover the full extent of his operations. The more they uncovered, the darker the story became. Greaves was more than just a kidnapper. He was a predator who had been operating under the radar for years, moving from state to state, abducting children and vanishing into thin air before anyone could catch up with him. It became clear that Greaves had a pattern. His victims were always children between the ages of 6 and 12, taken from remote locations like national parks, campgrounds, and hiking trails. He would keep them for years, grooming them, isolating them, and breaking them down in ways that made it nearly impossible for them to escape. Ethan, it seemed, had been one of the lucky ones to survive. The others, many of them, were still missing, their fates unknown. And then there was the mystery of the photos, the Polaroids, the tapes. Lynch had shared everything with Max, including the disturbing collection of photographs taken over the years. Many of them were children, some sleeping, some looking directly at the camera with hollow eyes. There was a series of images that seemed to suggest that Greaves had been recording his work, documenting his victims as though they were nothing more than objects. The photographs disturbed Max to his core, but he kept looking, kept digging into the twisted history that had bound his brother to this nightmare. One evening, as Max sat by Ethan's bedside, the boy finally turned to him and spoke more clearly than he had in days. Why did he do it? Ethan's voice was fragile, like the words might break if he spoke too loudly. Max had been expecting this question, but hearing it out loud was still a shock. He took a deep breath before answering, unsure of how to explain something so dark, so incomprehensible. I don't know, Max said quietly, his hand still resting on Ethan's. I think he was broken, Ethan, and he hurt people because of it. But none of it was your fault. Do you hear me? Ethan nodded faintly, his eyes searching Max's face as if trying to grasp something he couldn't quite understand. He seemed to be wrestling with the pieces of his memories, and Max could see the struggle in his eyes. I remember parts, Ethan said slowly, his voice trailing off. I remember him. Sometimes he'd tell me things, like I was special, like I had to be patient. He said I was the only one who understood him, but I didn't. Max's chest tightened. Hearing Ethan speak about Greaves with such a distant, almost mechanical tone made the bile rise in his throat. Ethan had been manipulated, twisted into someone else's idea of what he should be. Max couldn't bear the thought of what his brother had endured, and yet, he knew that understanding these small fragments of memory might be the only way to help Ethan heal. Ethan, Max whispered, leaning closer, his voice firm. You were never special to him. You were never his to control. You're my brother, and no one can take that away. Ethan looked at him, his eyes searching, uncertain. Max, what do I do now? Max's heart broke for him, for the innocence that had been stolen from his brother. You take it one day at a time. You don't have to figure everything out right now. We'll work through it together. You're not alone. Ethan seemed to settle a little, the storm in his eyes quieting. But Max knew that this was just the beginning. Ethan had a long road ahead of him. There would be no magic fix, no moment when everything clicked back into place. But Max would be there every step of the way. Weeks passed, and while Ethan's physical health improved, the scars left by years of captivity were more difficult to see. Max kept coming back to the hospital, each time hoping that the next visit would bring more clarity, more signs of Ethan's recovery. But there were good days and bad days, moments where Ethan would smile faintly, and others where he withdrew completely, locked inside the walls of his mind. Lynch continued her investigation, her pursuit of Greaves never slowing. But as the weeks wore on, Max couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. There were still other children out there, other families in the same hell he had just escaped. He couldn't ignore them. He couldn't let Greaves slip away. One day, after a particularly difficult night where Ethan had barely spoken and seemed lost in his own thoughts, Max received a call from Lynch. Max, we found something, she said, her voice tight with excitement. A new lead on Greaves. It's not much, but we might have found a place he's been hiding out. A remote cabin in a secluded part of the state. We need to move fast. Max's pulse quickened. This could be it, the break they had been waiting for. Greaves had been on the run for years, but now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Max had a chance to stop him, to ensure that no more children would suffer the way Ethan had. I'm coming, Max said immediately, without hesitation. The future was uncertain, the journey still long and fraught with danger. But as he stood there, watching his brother sleep, Max knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to put an end to this nightmare, to save the children who were still out there, and to give Ethan the chance to rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. He wasn't going to let Greaves win. Max barely slept that night. His mind raced with the implications of Lynch's call. They had a lead on Greaves, but the thought of finally confronting the man who had taken so much, his brother, so many innocent children, filled him with a mix of dread and resolve. Greaves was a shadow in the darkness, and Max was about to step into it, not knowing what he might find. The morning came too quickly, and Max didn't waste time. He packed his things quickly, then headed straight to the meeting point. The drive felt longer than it should have. His eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, his thoughts always pulling back to Ethan. What would the future hold for him? Max didn't know. But he did know this. He couldn't let Greaves slip away again. This time they were going to end it. Lynch was waiting when Max arrived, her face set in that same determined expression he had seen so many times before. She greeted him with a nod, and without another word, they climbed into an unmarked vehicle, ready to make the trip to the remote cabin where they believed Greaves had been hiding. The further they drove, the more isolated everything became. The roads became narrower, winding between dense woods. Max couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. This cabin, if it really was Greaves, was the kind of place no one would stumble upon by accident. Hidden in the wilderness, cut off from the world. It was the perfect place for someone like him to remain undetected. As they neared the location, Max's heart began to pound. The cabin was set back from the main road, surrounded by trees, hidden from view. It was old, weather-beaten, with chipped paint and broken windows. There were no lights on, no signs of life. But Max knew better. They were close, very close. Lynch signaled for the team to stop. The area was quiet, too quiet. The trees swayed in the breeze, and for a moment, Max thought he heard a distant noise, a faint rustling from the woods. He froze, his senses on high alert. But when he looked around, there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. Ready! Lynch's voice broke the silence, pulling him back to the present. Max nodded, his hand gripping the side of the vehicle. Let's do this. They moved quietly, their steps muffled by the soft ground. Max's breath felt heavy in his chest, the anticipation thick in the air. He knew they had to move fast. Every second mattered. The cabin stood ahead, its broken windows giving a glimpse into the dark interior. Lynch and the team fanned out, their eyes scanning the area. Max followed, his mind racing through every possible scenario, every possible danger. If Greaves was inside, he was likely armed, prepared to fight to the end. Max had to be ready for anything. Lynch signaled for the team to approach the back of the cabin. They moved quickly, quietly, like ghosts in the shadows. Max stayed close to Lynch, his eyes never leaving the cabin as they closed in. The door was old, the wood warped from years of neglect. But it wasn't locked. As they neared, Lynch carefully turned the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside was nothing like Max expected. There were no signs of life, no indication that anyone had been there for a while. Dust covered the floor, and the walls were lined with old, worn furniture. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. But there was something unsettling about it. The emptiness. The sense that the cabin had been abandoned in a hurry. Lynch held up a hand, signaling for everyone to stop. Max's heart was in his throat. They hadn't found Greaves yet, but this place felt like a trap. They had to be careful. Every corner could hide a weapon, a piece of evidence, or worse, a trap meant to catch them. They split up, each team member searching different areas of the cabin. Max moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he stepped deeper into the cabin. He could hear the faint sound of breathing, the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. It wasn't Greaves. It was something else. Suddenly, Max spotted something on the floor near the corner of the room. A small, crumpled piece of paper. He bent down to pick it up, his pulse quickening as he unfolded it. It was a drawing, crude but recognizable. The sketch of a child, his brother, Ethan. Max's stomach churned as he looked at the paper. The drawing was faint, scribbled with desperation. Ethan had drawn it. There was no doubt in his mind. Max! Lynch's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned around, his eyes locking onto hers. She stood by the window, her expression unreadable. You need to see this. Max crossed the room quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Lynch pointed toward the far side of the cabin, where a trapdoor lay partially open. Max's mind raced. The cabin was hiding something. Greaves wasn't gone. He was close. Too close. They made their way to the trapdoor, Lynch signaling for the team to be ready. Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much darker than he had anticipated. His mind flashed back to Ethan's story, the memories he had shared in fragments. The twisted relationship he had with Greaves, the manipulation, the isolation. It had all started here, in this very cabin. The trapdoor creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the basement. The air smelled damp and musty, and the darkness below felt suffocating. But Max didn't hesitate. He stepped down first, his flashlight cutting through the blackness. At the bottom of the stairs, the light illuminated something that made Max's blood run cold. There, in the far corner, was a makeshift bed, old blankets thrown haphazardly over a rusted metal frame. And in the corner of the room, lying in the shadows, was a familiar face. It was another child, emaciated, pale, their body wrapped in layers of ragged clothing. Max's heart stopped. This was the aftermath of what Greaves had done to Ethan, what he had done to countless others. The child stirred as the light touched them, their eyes flickering open. They looked up, their expression vacant, as if they didn't know what was real anymore. Lynch was beside Max now, her face grim. "We need to get them out of here." Max didn't speak. He couldn't. His focus was on the child. Another victim. Another soul trapped in the same nightmare Ethan had endured. And in that moment, Max knew that Greaves was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. They had to stop him. They had to stop him now. But as they prepared to pull the child to safety, a noise from above stopped them dead in their tracks. The unmistakable sound of a door opening. Max's pulse raced. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. Greaves was here. Max's heart pounded in his chest as the sound from above grew louder. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Someone was coming down the stairs. Lynch immediately signaled for the team to hide, pulling Max and the others back into the shadowed corners of the basement. Max barely had time to adjust before the footsteps grew closer. He could hear the creak of the floorboards overhead, each step deliberate, measured. Whoever was above them was coming down. He motioned to the child in the corner, signaling for them to stay quiet, and the child, though disoriented, complied, shrinking further into the darkness. Max's eyes flicked toward Lynch, who was already positioning herself near the stairs, ready for whatever came next. There was no turning back now. They had to confront him. They couldn't wait any longer. The footsteps grew louder, and Max's breath hitched. He stepped back toward the corner, trying to steady his nerves. His hands were shaking, but he gripped his gun tightly, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The figure above them was still coming down, and Max could almost feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. Then, finally, a shadow appeared at the top of the stairs. The first glimpse of the man they had been hunting for so long. It was Greaves. Max's pulse surged as the man appeared at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the faint light from above. He was tall, his movements slow and controlled, a dark figure in the gloom. His clothes were dirty, worn, as if he had been living off the grid for far too long. His face was gaunt, weathered from years of hiding, but his eyes, those ice-blue eyes, were as cold and calculating as ever. Max's blood ran cold. This was the man who had taken Ethan. This was the man who had shattered so many lives. Greaves was finally here, face to face with the very people he had been running from for years. But Greaves didn't seem surprised. He paused at the top of the stairs, scanning the room with a knowing look. It was as if he had expected them. He knew they were coming. His lips curled into a cold smile. Well, Greaves said, his voice low and calm. "I was wondering when you'd finally find your way here." Lynch's hand was on her gun, but she didn't draw it yet. She held Max's gaze for a split second, signaling him to wait, to see what Greaves would do next. Max's mind was reeling. He wanted to rush forward, to end this once and for all, but he knew better. They couldn't act rashly. Not with the children in the basement, not with Greaves still so dangerously calm. Greaves stepped down slowly, his eyes never leaving Max. "You've been chasing ghosts," he continued, his voice almost mocking. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But you're just like the others. You'll never understand. Never know what it takes to survive out here. You've been following the wrong trail all along." Max took a slow breath, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Where are the other kids, Greaves?" he demanded, his voice hard. "The ones you took. What did you do to them?" Greaves' smile faded, his expression shifting slightly. "What I did to them," he repeated, almost as though the concept was foreign to him. "I gave them a chance. I showed them the way. They were lost just like you. And now you're here, following the same path of destruction. But you're too late. You'll never be able to save them. They're already gone." The words hit Max like a punch to the gut. He knew Greaves was trying to break him, to make him doubt everything they had worked for. But Max couldn't let him get to him. Not now. Not after everything. "You're lying," Max said, his voice steady. "You've taken them. You've kept them. And now it's time to face the consequences." Greaves' eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Max saw something shift in him. A flicker of irritation, of something darker. "Consequences," Greaves sneered. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything? You think you're the hero in this story? There's no happy ending, Ward. There never was." Before Max could respond, there was a sudden movement from the shadows. One of the officers stepped forward, gun raised, but Greaves was quicker. In one fluid motion, he grabbed a nearby object, an old rusted pipe, and swung it at the officer with brutal force. The officer fell back with a yelp, clutching his head as Greaves moved with surprising speed. Max reacted instantly, moving forward, gun aimed at Greaves. The air seemed to freeze in that moment, the sound of his heartbeat deafening in his ears. The tension in the room was unbearable. He had to act now. But before he could pull the trigger, a loud crash echoed from above. The door at the top of the stairs slammed open with incredible force, and Max's heart stopped as a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Ethan. Max's breath caught in his throat as Ethan stood there, eyes wide, unsteady on his feet. His hands were trembling, his clothes disheveled, but it was him. It was his brother standing there in the middle of the chaos. Greaves turned at the sound of the door, his eyes widening briefly before a dark grin crossed his face. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice smooth and taunting. "I was wondering when you'd show up. I told you, Ethan. I told you that you would be the one to finish this." Max's mind raced, but he couldn't let his focus waver. He couldn't let Greaves win. "Ethan, stay back," Max shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Ethan looked confused, his gaze darting between Max and Greaves, as though unsure of what was real and what was just a mirage. "Ethan, it's me," Max repeated, his voice pleading. "You're not alone. I'm here. Please, just stay with me." Greaves took a step forward, his voice low and almost comforting. "He doesn't need you, Max. He never did. He's with me now." Max's eyes widened in horror as he realized what Greaves was doing. He was trying to manipulate Ethan, to use him as a tool in his sick game. "No," Max whispered, his voice filled with a mix of fury and fear. "You've taken enough from him. You don't get to take him, too." With a surge of determination, Max took a step forward, his weapon aimed at Greaves. The moment had come. There was no turning back. Max's heart raced as he moved closer, his gun aimed steadily at Greaves. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to end this madness right now, but his focus remained on Ethan. His brother stood at the top of the stairs, still in a daze, caught between two worlds. The one that Max was desperately trying to pull him back to, and the one that Greaves had trapped him in for so long. "Ethan," Max shouted again, his voice breaking through the tension. "You don't have to do what he says. You're not his. You're my brother. You're not a part of his game." Greaves turned his cold, calculating gaze toward Max, his smirk widening. "You think you can undo all the damage? You're too late. Max, Ethan has learned everything he needs from me. He's mine now." Max's fingers tightened on the grip of his gun. Greaves had been manipulating Ethan for years. He'd twisted his mind, broken him, but Max wasn't about to let that be the end of it. He wouldn't lose his brother again. "Ethan, listen to me," Max said, his voice trembling with emotion. "This is your chance. I'm here to bring you home. You don't belong to him, you never did. We can leave. We can fix this. Together. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the wind outside, the heavy breathing of the officers, and Max's own heartbeat thudding loudly in his chest. Max's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, willing him to understand, to fight whatever mental hold Greaves still had on him. Ethan's eyes flickered. Confusion, fear, and then something else, something faint but unmistakable. Recognition. Slowly, Ethan's hand twitched, as if reaching out. Max's breath caught. He was still in there. He could still be saved. But then the moment was shattered. Greaves' smile turned into a snarl. You really think you can save him, Max? You think you can fix this? It's too late for that. Before Max could react, Greaves lunged forward, faster than Max anticipated, knocking the gun out of his hands with a brutal swipe. Max stumbled back, landing hard on the ground, pain shooting up his spine. He looked up just in time to see Greaves turn toward Ethan. Ethan, you don't need him, Greaves said, his voice soft, almost coaxing. You know what I've shown you. You know what's real. It's time to let go of all these false attachments. Ethan didn't move at first, his gaze fixed on Max. The confusion was still there, but it was beginning to fade. There was something in Ethan's eyes now, a flicker of recognition, of connection. No, Max said through gritted teeth, pushing himself to his feet, still unarmed. Ethan, this isn't you. You're not his puppet. Fight it. Fight him. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen. His body was tense, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the flicker of recognition vanished, replaced by the cold, distant look that Greaves had molded in him. Max's heart sank as Ethan took a step forward, his expression blank, robotic. No! Max shouted, panic rising in his chest. But then, something incredible happened. As Ethan moved toward Greaves, he faltered. His legs wavered, and his gaze darted to the ground, almost like he was coming to his senses, even if only for a brief moment. Greaves noticed, his face twisting in irritation. What's wrong with you, boy? Don't listen to him. You belong to me. Max's eyes locked onto Ethan. Ethan, please, he begged. You don't belong to him. You're free now. You can be free. Ethan's eyes flicked between Max and Greaves, confusion still swirling inside him. His body shook slightly as if he was trying to fight the impulse that Greaves had been forcing into him for so long. Max took a step toward him, his voice gentle but filled with desperation. I'm your brother, Ethan. I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again. Something shifted in Ethan's eyes then. A brief flicker of humanity, of the boy Max remembered. It was enough. Enough to give Max hope. In an instant, Ethan moved. It wasn't a conscious decision, not one Max could explain. But his brother bolted toward Greaves with a sudden burst of energy. He slammed into the man, knocking him off balance, sending him crashing to the floor with a loud thud. Greaves let out a furious scream, more out of surprise than pain, as he scrambled to get back up. Max didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing his gun from the ground where it had fallen. Greaves was on his feet now, but before he could react, Max aimed the gun at him. His finger was poised on the trigger, but there was a hesitation, just for a moment. Was this the man who had ruined his life? Was this the man who had taken everything from him? Max took a breath. There would be no redemption for Greaves. No more second chances. Max pulled the trigger. The shot rang out through the cabin, deafening in the silence that followed. Greaves staggered back, a shocked expression on his face before he crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around him. Max stood there, his gun still aimed at the fallen man, as his heart pounded in his chest. His mind was still racing, trying to process what had just happened. Had he really just killed him? Was this the end of it? But when Max turned back to Ethan, he saw that his brother hadn't moved. He was still standing, trembling, his eyes wide with shock. Max stepped toward him, his heart aching as he reached out. Ethan? It's over. He can't hurt you anymore. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were blank, distant again. as though everything that had just happened had gone right over his head. Max's heart sank, but he didn't give up. He gently placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're safe now. I'm here." Ethan's gaze flickered again. This time it wasn't confusion or distance. It was something else. His mouth parted slightly, as if trying to say something. But before Max could speak, Ethan collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Max held him tightly, not caring that the cabin was now filled with silence, not caring that the man who had taken his brother was gone. What mattered was that Ethan was alive. He was here, and for the first time in so long, Max could feel his brother's presence, the warmth of his body, the rhythm of his breath. Max whispered into Ethan's ear, "I've got you. I'm never letting you go." Even though it seemed like everything had come to an end, the internal tension still clung to Max. He held Ethan, feeling his brother's body trembling from the horrors he had endured. But deep down, he knew the real journey of recovery had just begun. This was only the first step. Ethan was still crying, his tears mixing with the silence that had filled the room. Max held him close, as if trying to make up for all the years of pain and loss left in the wake of griefs. But despite the closeness, Max knew that this moment didn't mean the end of their struggles. Ethan's healing process had only just begun. When the sobs finally quieted, Ethan pulled away, his eyes still full of pain and confusion. Max gently lifted his brother's chin, trying to meet his eyes, but Ethan turned away. "You're safe now," Max said softly, trying to sound confident. "You're not alone." Ethan nodded, but there was no relief in his eyes. Max could feel the weight of it, the loss of his brother for so many years, the deep scars left by griefs. He couldn't expect Ethan to simply forget it all. The path to healing was going to be long, and it would take more than words to fix what had been broken. Ethan sat silently, his gaze unfocused, staring at the floor. It was like he was trying to make sense of what had just happened, of what Max had just said. He wasn't responding, wasn't meeting his brother's eyes. Max's heart clenched. He could feel the distance between them despite the physical closeness. "Ethan," Max whispered almost to himself. He had hoped that this moment would bring them back together, but it wasn't that easy. They both needed time. The years spent apart, the torment Ethan had lived through, couldn't be erased with a simple reunion. A few days passed, and although Ethan's physical health was improving, his mental state was fragile. Max spent every moment he could with him, talking to him, offering support, trying to break through the wall of silence that Ethan had built around himself. But no matter how hard Max tried, Ethan remained distant. He had been through too much, and the wounds, both physical and psychological, ran deep. Max tried to comfort him, but the feeling of helplessness lingered. He wasn't sure how to help his brother process what had happened. He wasn't sure what to say or do, but he knew one thing: he couldn't give up on him. Max received a call from Detective Lynch a few days later. Her voice was grim, but there was a note of urgency in it. "We've been looking into Greaves' past, trying to piece together what he was doing all these years. And there's something that came up, something we need to investigate." Max's stomach dropped at the words. Even though Greaves was gone, the fear, the danger wasn't completely over. There was more to uncover, more to understand. "Where are you?" Lynch asked. "We need to go over some new information. You might want to hear this." Max glanced at Ethan, who was sitting on the couch, staring out the window. It hurt to see him like this, so lost, so distant. But Max couldn't ignore the truth. There were more children out there, more victims of Greaves, and he couldn't stop now. "I'm on my way," Max said, his voice steady. He hung up and turned to Ethan. "I need to go, but I'll be back soon. We'll get through this together. Okay?" Ethan didn't respond, but he gave a small, hesitant nod. Max forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He was torn between the urge to stay and care for his brother and the responsibility to finish what had started all those years ago. As Max left the house, he glanced back at Ethan, who was still sitting there. The weight of it all, the past, the future, the unknown, pressed down on him. But Max knew that he couldn't rest until he was sure that Greaves had been stopped for good. At the detective's office, Max met with Lynch and the team. They were going over new leads, places Greaves had stayed, people he had interacted with, but the more they dug, the darker the picture became. Greaves wasn't just a lone abductor. He had connections, people who had helped him, who had turned a blind eye or worse, actively aided in his operations. "There are more victims out there," Lynch said, her voice tight with frustration. "And we're getting closer to finding out who else might have been involved. We need to finish this." Max nodded, the anger building in his chest. The road to healing for Ethan would be long, but for Max, the road to justice had to be shorter. Greaves was gone, but the damage was already done. The more they learned, the more he understood that Greaves wasn't the only monster in this story. There were others, people who needed to be held accountable for the pain they had caused. That night, Max returned home, but sleep was hard to come by. His mind kept racing. Ethan had shown some signs of life in the last few days, but Max still couldn't shake the feeling that his brother was lost somewhere deep inside himself. Max knew the journey wasn't going to be quick, but he would be there every step of the way. They would figure this out together. Ethan was in the kitchen when Max came in, sitting at the table, his head down. Max stopped in the doorway, watching him for a moment. "You okay?" Max asked, his voice soft. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting Max's. For the first time in days, there was a hint of recognition there. A flicker of the brother Max had known. I don't know," Ethan said, his voice raw. "I don't know how to be the person I was before." Max walked over, sitting down beside him. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take it one day at a time." Ethan nodded slowly, his hand clenching on the table. He didn't speak again, but for the first time in so long, Max could feel a shift. Ethan was still in there, still fighting to come back to himself. And Max would be there, every day helping him fight, whatever it took. The days turned into weeks, and while the physical wounds from Ethan's time with Greaves began to heal, the emotional scars remained. Max stayed close, always there when Ethan needed him. But there were times when Ethan would retreat into silence, his mind lost in the dark spaces where Greaves had once trapped him. It was hard to watch, harder still to know that there were no quick fixes, no magical words that would heal everything at once. Max kept himself busy, meeting with Lynch and following up on every lead they could find. They were closing in on Greaves' network, and Max knew that putting an end to it meant a future where children wouldn't face the same horrors Ethan had. But no matter how much progress they made, the weight of what Ethan had suffered never truly left Max. He couldn't stop thinking about the brother he once knew, the boy who had once been full of laughter and life, and how much that had been ripped away from him. One evening, as Max sat at the kitchen table, going over old case files, Ethan walked in quietly. Max looked up, surprised to see him. It had been a while since Ethan had come to him willingly, and Max felt a surge of cautious hope. "Hey," Max said softly, setting the papers aside. "What's up?" Ethan stood in the doorway, his posture stiff, but there was something different in his eyes. He seemed calmer, more aware. For a moment, Max could almost see the old Ethan, the boy who had been his shadow in the woods, laughing as they raced through the trees. "I want to go out," Ethan said, his voice still quiet but firm. Max raised an eyebrow, unsure if he understood. "Out? You mean like outside? You're sure?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I think I need to. I'm tired of being inside." Max hesitated. He wasn't sure if this was the right time, if Ethan was truly ready. But at the same time, he knew this moment was important. Ethan hadn't really expressed a desire to do anything for himself in weeks, so this felt like a breakthrough, even if it was small. "Okay," Max said, his voice gentle. "We can go for a walk. Just take it slow, all right? No rush." Ethan nodded, and they headed outside together, stepping into the cool evening air. The sky was streaked with the orange and purple hues of sunset, and Max could feel a slight tension lift in his chest as they walked down the familiar path toward the woods. It wasn't much, just a short walk down a trail Max had walked 100 times with Ethan when they were younger, but it felt like something significant, something that marked a step forward for both of them. As they walked, Max kept a careful eye on Ethan, but his brother seemed at ease. He didn't say much, just walked beside Max, his hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze on the ground. For the first time in weeks, Max didn't feel the constant need to check on him, to watch for signs that Ethan might retreat again. They were just walking, and that was enough. They reached the clearing near the edge of the forest, the place where Max and Ethan had spent so many summer afternoons, playing catch, talking about their dreams, and exploring the wilds of the woods. The place felt like a memory, a time before everything had fallen apart. Max stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face Ethan. "I used to think we'd never stop coming here," he said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You remember the treehouse we built?" Ethan nodded, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. "Yeah, I remember. I think we left some stuff in it. Maybe it's still there." Max chuckled. "We should go back sometime. Just, for old time's sake." For the first time since they had arrived, Ethan's eyes lifted to meet his. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, a sense of something opening up between them again. It was still fragile, still tentative, but it was there. "I think I'd like that," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Max's heart swelled. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Ethan was coming back. Not all at once, not the way Max had imagined, but in small, fragile steps. And that was enough. Later that evening, after their walk, Max sat in the living room, scrolling through more case files. But his mind kept drifting back to that moment in the clearing, Ethan's smile, the look of quiet determination in his eyes. It was a small thing, a quiet shift, but Max felt it. The boy he had lost was slowly coming back to him. The phone rang, snapping Max out of his thoughts. He picked it up quickly, expecting another update from Lynch or a lead on the investigation. "Max." Lynch's voice was tense, her words quick. "We need to talk. It's about Greaves." Max's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "We found something new. A potential accomplice," Lynch said. "Someone we didn't expect." Max's blood ran cold. "Who?" "There's a connection to one of the people Greaves had contact with," she said, her voice heavy with urgency. "Someone who's been working in the shadows, covering his tracks. We think they might be responsible for more than just hiding Greaves. They could be involved in the whole network. We need to act quickly." Max's mind was racing, his body tense. He had been hoping for a moment of peace, a moment to breathe, but there was no time for that. Greaves might be gone, but the threat wasn't over. There were still more lives at risk. "I'm on my way," Max said, his voice firm. He stood up quickly, looking at Ethan, who was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. Max felt the familiar pang of guilt, leaving his brother behind, knowing he still needed him. But he couldn't ignore the danger. Greaves' network hadn't vanished with his death. There were still people out there who needed to be stopped. "I'll be back soon," Max said, his voice softer now. "Stay here, okay?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, but after a moment, he looked up, his expression more serious than usual. "I'll be here." Max left the house quickly, his mind racing again. But this time it wasn't just about bringing justice. It was about protecting his brother. Ethan might have taken his first steps toward recovery, but the road ahead would still be full of dangers, both external and internal. But Max was ready. For the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever came next. For Ethan and for himself. Max drove through the winding roads toward the meeting point, his thoughts consumed by the urgency of Lynch's call. Every mile seemed to stretch into an eternity. The past few weeks had been a delicate balance of healing and action. But now, it seemed like they were about to dive back into the chaos they had hoped to leave behind. Greaves might be dead, but the poison he had spread, the network of criminals and abusers that had supported him, was still out there. As Max pulled into the parking lot near the sheriff's office, he saw Lynch standing by her car, looking every bit as tense as he felt. She didn't waste any time greeting him, her face hard with focus. "Max, we've got a lead," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's bigger than we thought. The person we're tracking, he's been a ghost for years. But we've finally narrowed it down." Max's pulse quickened. "Who is it? What do we have?" Lynch handed him a thick manila folder. "This is Charles Holt. He's been on our radar for a while, but we only just connected the dots. He's been moving across state lines, renting properties, using fake IDs, all to avoid detection. We think he's been helping Greaves and other abusers keep their operations hidden." Max flipped through the file, scanning through pictures, aliases, and locations. Holt's face appeared in several photos, always blurry, always a few steps ahead of the law. But there was something about the man that made Max's blood run cold. Holt wasn't just a facilitator. He was the one who had helped keep the system running, the one who had covered Greaves' tracks for years. "We're close, Max. We're getting closer to the people who helped Greaves do what he did. And now it's time to stop them once and for all," Lynch continued. Max nodded, his mind spinning. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The feeling of unfinished business gnawed at him. Greaves' death had been a relief, but it wasn't enough. Not while there were still people out there who had been complicit in his horrors. "We need to act fast," Max said, his voice resolute. "What's the plan?" Lynch took a breath, then nodded toward the car. "We're going to hit one of Holt's properties. He's renting an abandoned house just outside of town, under another false name. It's small, isolated, and we believe it's where he's been hiding out." Max's mind raced as they got into the car, the headlights cutting through the dark. The final confrontation was close. He didn't know if he was ready for it, but he knew they had no choice. Holt had to be stopped. And, in some twisted way, Max felt like the final pieces of the puzzle were coming together. This was the closure he had been waiting for. The final step toward truly freeing Ethan from the horrors of the past. The drive to the property was tense. Max's thoughts kept flicking back to Ethan, to the small steps he had taken in the last few weeks, to the fragile hope that was slowly building. He didn't want to leave his brother alone, but this was something that had to be done. He couldn't let Ethan live in the shadow of Greaves' influence any longer. They arrived at the house under cover of night. The area was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. The house itself was barely standing, a dilapidated structure on the edge of a forest. It looked like a place people had forgotten about, a place where secrets could fester. Lynch motioned for the team to spread out, and they approached the house cautiously, their steps muffled by the soft earth. Max's heart was pounding, his mind focused entirely on what was ahead. They had to find Holt, and they had to find him now. No more waiting, no more uncertainty. They reached the house, and Lynch gestured for them to check the back. Max and a few officers went around the side, covering each angle. The house was silent, too quiet for comfort. The windows were dark, the door hanging slightly ajar as if someone had recently entered, or left in a hurry. Max took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of decay and abandonment hanging in the stagnant air. Every instinct screamed at him to be careful, but there was no time for hesitation. They moved through the house slowly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the remnants of a place left behind. There was evidence that someone had been living there. Papers scattered on the floor, half-empty food containers, and the faint traces of cigarette smoke still clinging to the air. Max's heart raced as they reached the back room. He could hear the faint sounds of movement, footsteps, a rustling sound from behind the door. Without thinking, he pushed the door open, gun raised. But there was no one inside. Max's blood ran cold as his flashlight landed on the floor. The room was empty, but there were traces of something else. A set of footprints, fresh and still visible in the dust, leading to a trapdoor in the corner. The trapdoor was slightly ajar, and Max's stomach dropped. "He's here," Max muttered, his voice tight. "Holt's hiding below." Lynch and the team quickly surrounded the trapdoor, readying themselves for whatever lay beneath. Max knew this was it, the final confrontation. The weight of everything that had happened, everything they had worked for, was bearing down on him now. Lynch gave the signal, and they moved down into the basement. The air down there was colder, thicker, and Max's flashlight illuminated a small, sparse room. There were crates, old furniture, and boxes stacked against the walls. But there was something else. something that made Max's blood run cold. Charles Holt was sitting in the far corner, his back to them. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture, his stillness, told Max everything he needed to know. Holt had been waiting. He had known they were coming. "You're too late," Holt said, his voice low, mocking. He turned slowly, revealing a wicked smile. "You think you've won, don't you? You're just as blind as Greaves. You'll never stop us." Max didn't respond. There was no need for words. The time for talking was over. He moved forward, his grip tightening on his gun, his finger poised over the trigger. Holt might be the last piece of this nightmare, but Max wasn't going to let him get away. Not this time. Max stepped forward, his eyes locked on Holt, his mind focused on the task at hand. Holt's grin only widened as he took in Max's stance. The smugness in his eyes only fueled Max's anger. It wasn't just about stopping him anymore, it was about justice, about putting an end to the cycle of pain that people like Holt and Greaves had started. "You don't get to hide anymore," Max said, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. "This ends now." Holt didn't flinch. "You really think you can stop all of us? You're a fool. There are more of us than you know." Max took a slow, deliberate step closer. Holt's words were designed to provoke him, to make him hesitate, but Max couldn't afford to be distracted. He couldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. He had to finish this. For Ethan. For every other child who had suffered because of people like Greaves and Holt. "You're not untouchable anymore," Max said, his voice colder. "This ends here. Now." Max motioned to Lynch, who had positioned herself behind him, keeping the other team members alert and ready. The walls of the basement felt like they were closing in, the air thick with tension. Holt was cornered, but Max could tell he wasn't giving up without a fight. Before Max could take another step, Holt's eyes flashed with something dangerous, an almost imperceptible movement, a glance toward a cabinet in the corner. Max didn't hesitate. His instincts screamed at him to act, and in a split second he fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the basement. Holt staggered, his hand flying to his side. But the shot hadn't been meant to kill. It was meant to disable, to keep him from reaching for whatever weapon he might have been planning to use. Holt's face twisted with pain, but he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged for something under the table. Max's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the shape of the object before Holt could fully grab it. A knife. He was going to fight back. Max quickly advanced, his gun trained on Holt. "Don't move." But Holt wasn't listening. With a growl of defiance, he threw the knife with expert precision, aiming straight for Max. Max barely had time to react. The knife caught the sleeve of his jacket, but it didn't pierce his skin. He could feel the rush of air as it flew by, but it was too close, too quick. He didn't waste a second. He fired another shot, this time directly at Holt's leg. Holt dropped to the ground, the knife clattering beside him. He gasped in pain, but his defiance was still there. He glared at Max, his eyes full of rage. But he couldn't get up. He couldn't fight anymore. Max stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on Holt. "It's over. You're done." Lynch moved in quickly, securing Holt with handcuffs as the rest of the team surrounded him. Holt muttered under his breath, but the fight had left him. He was done. Max stood over him, taking in the man who had caused so much suffering, who had helped enable Greaves, and yet, somehow, managed to escape justice for so long. Now finally it was over. Max didn't leave Holt's side. As the team called for backup and prepared to bring him into custody, Max remained rooted in place. His mind was still racing, replaying the entire moment, the danger that had come so close to ending him. But it wasn't just about stopping Holt. It was about making sure that Ethan, his brother, had a chance at freedom. As they moved Holt into the transport vehicle, Max found himself staring at the spot where the fight had taken place. It felt unreal, like the weight of it was still sinking in. Holt had been the last piece in a long, painful puzzle, and now it was finally finished. Later that night, Max returned home. The house was quiet when he entered, the air still, like everything had been frozen in time while he was gone. The moment he stepped into the living room, he saw Ethan sitting by the window, his figure outlined by the moonlight, staring out into the night. Max took a deep breath, his body still tense from the events of the day, but a small part of him, something buried deep inside, felt lighter. It was over. Holt had been caught, and the network was dismantled. Greaves' legacy of horror had finally come to an end. Ethan didn't look up at first, but Max could see that he was aware of his presence. He walked over slowly and sat beside him. "Hey," Max said quietly, breaking the silence. "It's over." Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Max's. There was something different in his gaze. A sense of quiet understanding, like he had been holding his breath for too long and was finally able to exhale. "I know," Ethan said softly, his voice almost too faint to hear. Max didn't know what to say. Words never seemed to be enough for everything they had been through, everything they had lost. But for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like the world was closing in around them. There was hope, however fragile it seemed. Ethan was starting to heal. Max reached out and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to go through this alone anymore. I'll be here. Always." Ethan nodded, his eyes still distant but softer now. "I know." The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came with a shared understanding, a mutual sense of relief. They didn't have to have all the answers right away. They had time. They had each other. Max stayed there with Ethan for a long time, watching the night unfold, feeling the weight of everything finally begin to lift. It wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, and the scars would take time to heal. But in that moment, Max knew one thing. His brother was coming back to him, and they would face whatever came next together.